Kia ora, we've got Adrian, Petra, and Lauren. Is Nick? No, Nick's not online. Cool. Thank you. So just want to, as you speak, introduce yourselves and your role, and then we'll go through the presentation. Kia ora. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Lauren Simpson Tuguinga. I'm the Acting Chief Sustainability Officer currently, and joining me is Petra Pearce, Lead Climate Adaptation Resilience Advisor. Lead Mitigation Advisor is Adrian Bersenville, and online is Nick McKenna. I'd just like to acknowledge Nick for coordinating the inputs from about at least 50 staff to bring this report together, so that was no mean feat. Online we also have Tim Adrianson and Rob Simpson from the Transport Strategy team who are there to support if needed. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is our roadmap of climate action. You can see it goes back to 2015 when we joined C40 Cities. I'm not going to cover all of this history. I'm really just going to focus on the milestones of the last year. So starting at the bottom of the curve there, we have the adoption of the National Adaptation Plan. That is government's response to the priority risks in the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, and sets the long-term approach for government about adaptation. Next to that is the adoption of the Transport Emissions Reduction Pathway by Council. That was a huge milestone. That sets our pathway for the transformation of our transport system, which is our largest emissions source, and you heard all about that yesterday. Moving up, we've got the very tragic events of the Auckland anniversary weekend floods, followed by Cyclone Gabrielle. Not milestones to be celebrated, but why they're important to climate action is that they did prompt the development of a number of programs across Council in resilience and adaptation. For example, the Storm Response Fund, which is a $20 million targeted rate that aims to increase resilience in our communities and increase our emergency response capability. And there was also the, which is not mentioned there, but the Making Space for Water project, which is about improving our resilience to floods in high-risk areas, and that ties in with the high-risk properties buyout that was agreed with government recently. So just quickly, this is the third annual progress report that we're bringing to you on Te Tarakia Tawhiri. It covers an evaluation of our progress on our action, summarising our successes and challenges, and provides an outline of our future focus areas. We try to bring this report to you each year in line with other related and significant report updates. For instance, you've just had the Auckland plan, and the next one you'll be hearing from is the water strategy. And just to note that this plan has been contributed to by teams from right across the group. So this is not just a report for the Chief Sustainability Office, but is actually delivered by the entire organisation. So many of you wouldn't have seen this before. So this is the governance structure for Te Tarakia Tawhiri. For start, across the bottom we have our priority areas outlined there. The natural environment, built environment, transport, economy, communities and coast, food, te pō waitangi o te tātai, which is a Māori outcomes priority, and energy and industry. Above that we've got the action owners and partnerships. These are both internal to council and CCOs, and also external stakeholders, and these action owners are essential in driving the delivery of actions. Then we have the Chief Sustainability Office is the lead, so we're responsible for the facilitation or facilitating implementation of Te Tarakia Tawhiri and reporting on its progress. The boxes to the right-hand side represent our external stakeholders. So you've got the advisory panels there first. There are 5 demographic advisory panels, and there are representatives of each of those on a climate cross-panel advisory group, which forms or gets together as and when required to advise on climate action. Above that is the Rangatahi Ropu. That was a project funded through the LTP, and that has been established. That should actually be a solid box now that I look at it. And they have met numerous times in the last financial year developing action plans. Their purpose is to set up Māori-led projects, and we actually have, or Council is supporting 2 Māori-led projects that were set up by this Ropu. And then the top box there, the Regional Leadership Group, that is in development currently. That will have stakeholders from across all sectors, and it is designed to focus on cross-sector partnership. Its purpose is to help accelerate action in areas that Council doesn't have direct control over. On the the left-hand side, those boxes relate to Council. So we developed the Climate Political Reference Group, which has representatives from elected members from Council and local boards, and that meets as and when required to advise on action development. And then, of course, we report into this committee. You'll note that mana whenua is not specifically mentioned in its own box in that governance structure, but is a very critical part to the delivery of Te Tarakia Tawhiri. So we partnered with, or Council partnered with, the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum in development of Te Tarakia Tawhiri, and we're now working with the INS Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum and Māori advisory staff on how we translate that governance model or that governance partnership into an operational delivery phase. And so we have been meeting with them in the last financial year and will continue to do so. So this is an overview of our monitoring and reporting framework, which is what we're reporting on to you, for you today. At the top there, we've got our emissions reduction targets of 50% emissions reduction by 2030 and net zero emissions reduction by 2050. We have not specified any adaptation targets there. We do have a few related to the urban ngāhere canopy cover, water security and efficiency, and biodiversity, for example, but we have some gaps in some key areas in our adaptation target development, and we have completed phase 1 of that work. We will be moving into phase 2 of that work soon, and some of the projects that we have operating in Council at the moment, including Resilient Auckland and Making Space for Water, will help inform development of those targets. So across the table there, we've got our priorities listed across the top, and below that are 3 layers of reporting. And I'll produce a slide, I'll talk to a slide for each of these. But the action areas, you can see under the natural environment, there are 5 action areas and there are 25 actions within those areas. So I'll provide a high-level overview of how we're progressing on those actions, how many are on track, underway or not started. On the second layer of reporting are our progress indicators. So in the white boxes there are the total number, or white circle, sorry, the total number of indicators that we have in the plan that we report on, and we report on all of those every 3 years. The first report was last year. That was our baseline report for all indicators, so that was published later last year. In the red circles, those are the headline indicators. They're the ones that we report on annually, and I'll show you a slide on those shortly. So before I move on to the third layer, I'd just like to acknowledge Te Pua Waitangi o Te Tātai, the Māori Outcomes Priority. So it's different, there are no actions associated with it. It's a principles-based priority, so very different to the others. The idea is that these Te Ao Māori principles are integrated in the design and implementation of all of the other priority area and actions. And just relating to, again, Te Pua Waitangi o Te Tātai, at the progress indicator level, We currently do not have indicators for monitoring the implementation of those principles. I'm sure, as you can appreciate, there are challenges with developing a monitoring framework to adequately measure the implementation of a principles-based priority. We did start the work on that, and unfortunately we had staff movements that meant that we had to put that work on hold. We are in the process of recruiting for a Māori specialist Māori advisor that will, where development of a monitoring and evaluation framework for this priority area will be a key focus for that person. So moving on to our third level of reporting, our cross-cutting indicators. These come from our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and they provide the net emissions and gross emissions for the region, and our emissions by sector. So I'll just go into those three areas now. So starting with the actions. These bars, there's a bar there for each of the priority areas and an overall total bar at the top. What you're looking at is that the blue sectors represent the percentage of actions that are complete. The green sectors represent the actions that are on target. The dark blue sectors represent the actions that are partially underway and need more work, and the red represents action, or the percentage of actions that are not yet underway. So there are a total of 179 actions. It's a lot, that's why we don't report on them individually. And it's important to note that Council does not have full control over the implementation of all of these actions. So our span of control ranges from direct control, partial control, to just having an influencing role. And that does have some influence over how fast some of these action areas have progressed. So you can see, looking at the total bar at the top, we've got 3% of actions are completed, 31% of actions are on track, 52% of actions are underway but require more work, and 13% are not in progress. So comparing that with last year, the bar at the bottom of the screen there, if we combine the actions on track and underway, that gives us 86% for this reporting year versus 85% for the previous year. And we have reduced the percentage of actions not in progress from 15% to 13%. So there is some modest improvement there on the previous year. Okay, so second layer of reporting, our progress indicators. So we've got our priority headings across the top there with the headline indicators underneath. The green dots represent a positive change, a change that is a trend that is good for climate. Yellow represents no change, and red represents a negative change or change that is not good for climate. It's painting quite a rosy picture. There are a lot of green dots. We can probably take this with a grain of salt this year for a couple of reasons. One is the impact of COVID. So some of these indicators were impacted by COVID for a couple of years. And also the fact that we've only got 3 years of reporting to base a trend on. So just to drill into a couple of these to give you an example, if we look at the millions of litres of petrol and diesel purchased annually, that's showing a positive trend in that, in theory, we are using less. In reality, what is happening there is that between the reporting years 2021 and 2022, consumption reduced in fuel, and then fuel consumption increased between 22 and 23 reporting years. It's still showing a positive trend, but obviously the fact that it's gone up from last year is not great, but it's also not surprising because fuel use was impacted by COVID in the first 2 years. Similarly, the public transport boardings are a really great result, moving from 41 million boardings last year to 71 in this reporting year, 71 million in this reporting year. So it's great to see that's bouncing back from the impacts of COVID. And just to point you, I guess, toward another good news story would be the tonnes of domestic food scraps diverted from landfill. So that was just over 1,000 tonnes diverted in the previous year versus over 1,800 tonnes in this reporting year, and that's a result of increased implementation of our food scraps collection program. And you'll notice there is a red dot on the energy and industry priority there for the electricity consumption. That is based on our inventory data, which I'll show you next, which is based on 2019 data. So it's showing an increase because at that time we had dry weather, and that's to do with the proportion of coal and hydro. So that's not very recent. Okay. So third layer of reporting is our greenhouse gas emissions inventory. What you can see there, zigzaggy line going upward, are our emissions inventories that we've been reporting since 2009. So we've got a really good record there. Unfortunately, it's going up. Our targets are based on a 2016 baseline, and you can see 2016 marked on the line there. So since 2016, our emissions have raised 5.4%. But just to note also that is based on 2019 data, so there is a lag, unfortunately. We are working to improve that lag. The difficulties come around acquiring the data, and process improvements have meant that, so the 2019 inventory was published late last year. Later this year, we'll be able to publish both the 2020 and 2021 data sets. So that's certainly an improvement, and we'll continue to work on that to reduce that lag time. What you can see there with since 2016 and subsequent inventories that have been published is that our trajectory down to our 2030 target keeps steepening, and that will continue to happen if we do not sharply reduce our emissions. And the steeper that curve gets, the more disruptive and costly the action will become. So it's really important that we make really concerted and ambitious efforts to reduce our emissions very soon. And just down the bottom there, we've got by sector our three biggest emitting sectors, which, not surprising, transport is our highest one at 45.6%, energy at 28%, and our industrial processes at 18%. Yeah. So that's a very sobering look at our situation. I'm going to move on to some feel-good highlights. This is just a snapshot of some of the really good work that's happening across the organisation. There is a lot more in the progress report, so I do encourage you to go and have a look and see all the good work that is being done. So the climate action targeted transport targeted rate, which used to be the climate action targeted rate, was adopted in June last year. It has, in its last year, just starting, it's in its planning and pre-implementation phase, so not a huge amount of action delivered yet, but it's setting itself up to deliver a lot more action in the next financial year. So things that it has been working on are the design of the charging infrastructure for the electric ferries at 3 different locations, and there is a new electric ferry on order with more to be ordered in the next financial year. 2 new frequent bus routes came online, and they have contributed an extra 4,000 boardings per day. And the Urban Ngāhere program has for the next planting season, which will be next winter. The long-term plan climate action investment package, that is really ramping up now. It's recovering from the struggles it had with recruiting staff and with COVID lockdowns, and it's really going along quite well now. So the Climate Action grant was fully subscribed, and 45 community groups were supported through those grants, and 20% of those were underserved communities. There were 22 hectares of tree planting undertaken. There were 53 additional zero emission buses added to the fleet, and the essential vehicle zone on Queen Street was established. And there's been a lot of really good work done around corporate emissions reduction, and that's including putting solar on aquatic centres, converting gas boilers, and also converting some of our heating and water systems from gas. Okay, so where do we need to focus on? So in the coming year, obviously we've seen we need to do a whole lot more work, and council will need to be responsible for a lot of that work, but we can't do it on our own, and we're going to need to work with stakeholders right across the region. So an important part of accelerating that delivery, one of the things that we will be working on is developing the regional leadership group. We also need to continue to work with mana whenua to deliver on Te Tarakia Tawhiri, and making sure that we are honouring that partnership that we had in the development of Te Tarakia Tawhiri and bringing that into the implementation phase as well. So we'll continue to work with the INS Mana Whenua Forum and Māori specialist staff. If we're going to make the really significant change that we need to make, we need to ensure that climate is central to every decision we make across our policy, strategy and investments. And there are a number of things that we have been doing, for instance, the Future Development Strategy, which supports a compact urban form, as well as moving away from developing in hazard areas. We also need to, we've also been working on local board plans, so rather than moving away from the dedicated climate plan that some of the local boards have, we've now worked with local boards to integrate climate into all local board plans. Things that we'll be continuing to do in the next financial year, we'll be working on the development of the long-term plan, and we'll be doing that through the investment impact assessment, which contains criteria around climate that all our investments will be assessed against. And we'll also be developing policy around dynamic adaptive policy pathways to help council make better decisions about the resilience of its assets and the community for the future. We need to be focusing on high impact areas, so we've talked a lot about the flood work that's happening across the organisation. We'll continue to do that work, and how important, you've been hearing yesterday as well, how important our transport system is to delivering on our climate goals. So we'll be focusing there, and we know that there are lots of really great options for taking action that are cost effective. And the last thing there is improving our monitoring and evaluation. So we need to be making sure that the measures that we're using are fit for purpose, that we're better able to measure how individual actions are contributing to our goals. So that will be a key focus going forward. So I'll leave it there. I'll hand back to the chair for questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauren and team. Huge amount of work to bring this all together. Again, I have 4 questions so far. Councillor Henderson.
Thank you, Chair. Just aware that the run rate required on climate emissions is getting pretty steep for 2030. Is there a reason why we're using 2019 data, given the changes since 2019?
There is a lag time in our emissions inventory development. So it's mostly around the acquiring of data. So there's a large number of organisations we need to work with to acquire the data for the inventory. They likely have quite a delay in acquiring the data themselves from within the organisations. So they have a delay, we have a delay getting it from them. Then there's the synthesis of the data and the development of the report. I don't know if Adrian, if you have anything to add to that. Yep. So we are working with the stakeholders and our own processes to reduce that lag. So that's why this year we're able to provide both the 2020 and 2021 inventories, acknowledging there is still a lag there, but it's improving.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Kia ora, Councillor. Yes, I found out quite early in the development that we can measure air quality very easily and get that data pretty quick, but carbon emissions is a much far longer lag for all organisations. Member Ashby.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. some good work in there, and some good outcomes and some worrying trends. So thank you to Councillor Henderson for asking one of the questions. Just a couple from me. One, I'm interested in the tree cover metric. You've got no update there, if you could speak to that. And also, I'm just curious, given increasingly we can't, we need to think of the biodiversity side of climate change as well, and this seems like one indicator where it would make sense to combine them. Obviously, in the rush to tree cover, we're going to end up, if we're not careful, with a very mono-species sort of coverage. You can only have so many harakeke and manuka that our ecosystems actually need. So if you could speak to that briefly. And I just have two other questions. One is obviously we've gone through our recent annual budget. Has it impacted the rollout of any of this, i.e. slowed it down? And the second question, or third I guess, is you've spoken about continuing to work in partnership with mana whenua through the forum. What other ways are you going to engage with mana whenua? Just being cognizant of the fact not all iwi turn up to those forums? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ashby, through the chair. So starting with the tree cover, similar situation to the inventory actually. The LiDAR, the canopy cover is determined by LiDAR surveys, so it's done by, I think that's aeroplane, was it satellite? Satellite, aeroplane flyover? And they're done every six or so years. So that's why that data is old. They're very time consuming and expensive, so they're not done very often. The biodiversity question around the varieties used in the Urban Ngāhere program, I'm sorry, I can't speak to that, and we don't have any of the biodiversity team here today, but that's something we can respond to.
Kia ora, Member Ashby. Have Councillor Dalton and I have met with the Urban Ngāhere team, and we're looking to hopefully have it at the next full presentation on the rollout and ability to answer all those questions, because there's some fantastic, you'll see 1.6 million trees planted, through some of these actions, but the detail there, I can tell you on the 200 hectares of planting in regional parks, that was originally a plan just for, as you say, trees, but then now it's about, the funding was changed to ensure understory and kind of different types of trees that help each other. So there was far broader, it meant a few less hectares at the beginning, but it'll get that more kind of thoughtful ecosystem rather than just chucking down, species, because we have found that in the past those didn't survive as well. So, but there'll be more information to come.
Thank you. Related to the annual budget, freeze on spending, yes, both the freeze and budget cuts have impacted delivery of some of the programs. Behaviour change is one that comes to mind. I know there were several others, and I'm sorry, we've actually noted them in the report, and I can't remember them off the top of my mind. But yeah, they are actually listed as impacts in the annual budget in the report itself. And the last question, engagement with mana whenua. So, for example, we on the development of the regional leadership group, we have been engaging with the Healthy Waters mana whenua advisory group. I'm sorry, I can't remember their exact name. It's a group of staff, Māori advisors that advise on engagement with mana whenua. We have received advice from them to engage with iwi individually, or to engage with what was the I think it's now the Tamaki Makaurau Mana Whenua Forum, which is what used to be the mana whenua Kaitiaki Forum. but that hasn't been operating in recent times, and so the next option is likely to then go and engage with the individual iwi on the development of that group. The INES, it was felt that the operational nature of the INES Mana Whenua Forum wasn't possibly the right forum for that particular project. So we will be adapting our engagement approach depending on the nature of the work that we're doing.
Good, remember, and that is something that we need to focus on, because there was Lauren, Alec and Matthew and team worked really hard to work with individual iwi chairs the whole way through the development. Obviously it's time consuming for those iwi chairs and their staff, so it's about how we make sure it's you know, good use of people's time, but also, you know, we need to discuss through our Māori outcomes focus around resourcing groups to do this work, because we do expect a lot of them. Kia ora, Councillor Walker.
I've got a few questions. Part of the context is that I led out the Council's first climate change strategy in the first term under Len Brown, and we had a whole range of teams, a huge amount of expertise, which has been jettisoned. But if I hark back to some of that, we've currently got a trajectory that's going up, okay? Fundamentally, the changes to stationary energy and particularly transport require the electrification of everything. That's a fundamental, I'd suggest, that is accepted, correct? Is there any reference in this strategy to the necessity for an energy strategy for Auckland? And my question around that is, one, where does the electricity come from? What is the planning for it? In particular, in order to meet peak demand across ferries, buses, cars, rail, and everything, and peak demand in itself is significant. So where is the buffering capacity in terms of batteries? What's the forecast increase in deployment of solar, wind, and whatever else is necessary to do this? And if those plans are not here, how can we come anywhere remotely in driving down that curve? So I'm actually interested in seeing that. If the answer is no, we don't have any of that information, we don't have any planning for any of it, then it would be useful to know. So a fairly simple question that goes initially to electrification.
Through the chair, if I can just answer just broadly around an energy strategy, then I'm happy for the team to add anything more. No, we are not doing any work on an energy strategy for Auckland. There is no resource for that. If this is a desire of the committee or the governing body, then we'll need to hear that. But no, we're not doing any work. We know there are organisations, including government organisations, Vector and others, that are working on this. And as always, we work with lots of organisations. Lauren mentioned that in her presentation. But there is no work we're specifically doing around that.
Okay.
And the MB
I am putting this up, Mr. Chair, as something that you might consider in moving, because I talk to other parties like Vector and private parties and others, and they approached us and looked for a lead from us, and we haven't got back to them. So I'll come back to that later. So there is no plan, there is no energy strategy for Auckland. The consequence is, at this point, it's an impossibility to actually take that curve down. The other question I've got is around what are the actual reductions in emissions that we're getting, and I'm not referring to a number of things that are happening, but what are we actually delivering on, and how are we measuring that on an annual basis so that we've got some real-time tracking? Is there any of that occurring?
I might answer the second question first on the real-time tracking. That's something we've been working on over the past year, knowing that we've got a significant gap in terms of our annual reporting, and that's definitely not assisting our decision making, to have an inventory which is dated 2019 when we are in 2023. So we are closing off that gap as much as we can, and we are reaching the 2021, which is not enough to be able to do some live tracking. So what we are working on now is more to implement some more real-life data tracking with some proxy data which are more accessible to the public, accessible to the decision makers and to us as well as staff, to make sure that we are seeing the trend, seeing the pictures and tracking the uptake of renewable energy across the region quite clearly on a daily, monthly basis as much as we can. So we are definitely working on that to really focus on proxy indicators and trends and meaningful change instead of just focusing on that end goal indicator about the greenhouse gas for the region. Regarding the way we bend that greenhouse gas curve, I would be probably a bit more nuanced about that one-for-one replacement from energy or fuel energy to electric energy. It's usually not a one-for-one, and that one-for-one does not work all the time. So you usually need to work around avoiding the emission, avoiding the need for the travel, for example. Do we actually need to travel by a car with an individual car with one person in the car, or can we carpool? Can we use public transport a bit more? So to reduce the need for the travel demand would reduce the need for that electricity demand to then be able to replace that fuel by an electrical fuel after. So we recognize that the electricity is not going to supply the full energy demand that we have currently, but we need to plan accordingly by reducing as much as we can. And then once we've reduced as much as we can, then we can replace that. And that's the same principle for the built environment in housing. We need to insulate more instead of just putting heat pump and let the energy go away. So that's energy efficiency and then replacement.
Okay, the other question I've got just goes to benchmarking, which I asked earlier. We may be a member of C40 and a number of those cities are tracking quite well, but equally there are smaller cities, particularly when we're a member of ICLEI, that we have not joined. So what benchmarking do we do across a number of things, electrification, buffer capacity for batteries, urban tree cover, and the like, compared to other cities that have active programs and in many instances are reporting annually? Are we benchmarking ourselves against other cities on an ongoing basis? And I'm not just referring to C40 because those cities, many of them are out of our league.
I can touch briefly on the C40, which is definitely not the objective of the C40 is more knowledge sharing and trying to learn together instead of benchmarking and trying to compare cities against each other. It's more trying to get the city together in working groups or sharing practices and some learnings. So we are evolving in different social environment, geographical environment, economic environment with different pressure, different context. So it's hard to benchmark and have a real comparison of one criteria because the situations are so different. So it's really trying to pick the good initiatives from the different cities and learn from the learnings or the mistakes from others as well to make sure that we are progressing as fast as we can, learning from others. So in that sense, we are not necessarily focused on that benchmarking, but more on that upskilling and learning.
Okay, the other question I've got just goes to the issue that Member Ashby raised about loss of tree cover. Other cities do heat mapping and the like. There's an enormous amount of satellite data that's available, much of it in real time. Can we not produce that data that would indicate where we're achieving tree loss? For example, right now we're achieving enormous tree loss across our munga because the trees are being actively removed, and I'm talking about trees that are many, many years old, in some instances over 100 years, with an enormous amount of stored carbon and very little likelihood of any replacement around that, and the ongoing loss of tree cover around Auckland. So as much as we can plant a lot of trees, what reporting are we doing around actuals as it goes to that?
Every 6 years we're doing the LiDAR monitoring, but in between the monitoring is around how many trees are being planted. I'm not aware of the other technologies that are available for more frequent monitoring, but that's something we can approach the Urban Ngāhere team about.
And again, that question just goes to benchmarking. Once you benchmark with other cities, you see what they're doing, and it's a virtuous loop. So the last question I've got just goes to the deployment of some specific areas that other cities are doing. Do we have anybody working on the deployment of solar panels across Auckland and wind? And how many people do we have across the organisation, and I'm thinking in particular of Auckland Transport, that are actually engaged in electrification?
I'm sorry, I couldn't speak to the numbers, but certainly we have funded projects to install solar panels on council facilities, and I'm not sure, Adrian, are you able to comment on any?
I mean, how would we rate, for example, compared to Australian cities around solar deployment?
Oh, sorry, Nick, did you have a comment?
Nick, you keen to?
Through the chair. And just in response to the question, firstly, just going back to the Ngāhere, I just want to make the point that within the report there is some commentary around some new software that has been developed to estimate tree planting structure and ecosystems and relating risks to Ngāhere, and that also estimates carbon storage and sequestration values as well. So can definitely send through some more information on that council iTree software that has been developed in the natural environment priority. Just to the second point around the, I guess, the solar panel, there is funding within the LTP Climate Action investment that is looking to reduce council's footprint by 50% in line with the climate targets. So there is a number of projects outlined in the report in the energy and industry section that shows all the really good work around the different projects that have solar panels being installed, along with other work around decarbonising the use of gas within council properties. I don't have the exact numbers of people working on hand, but I can definitely find some more information out and come back to you on that.
Reserve my rights.
Kia ora, Councillor. Just on the Ngāhere around rapid reduction, I think the 2020 survey, 2019 survey that we got the data in 2020 showed a 0.5% increase in tree cover across Auckland. The difference, though, was that it was increasing quite well on public land, but those larger trees on private land, since the law was changed that removed general tree protection, that has reduced quite significantly over time. But we will get that. I think it's the data from next year. On the energy strategy, there is the government. The MB one is being led next year for the whole of New Zealand. We will be part of that. Whether we can get a picture for Auckland rather than duplicating that quite, it's a significant body of work. But we will be working with MB on the whole New Zealand strategy. I think through Te Tarakia Tawhiri, we did consider a lot of focus on solar, but the discussion was bang for buck of emissions, because we're not like Australia. They have very, very high fossil fuel energy, whereas at the moment, I think with all the rain, we're sitting in the 90s, or down to 80% on average. So it's around where we focus our time. Obviously, we do want to reduce our energy reliance, but because so much of our network is renewable already, that wasn't a huge focus for council's money. But the MOU with Vector with AT has been a really, really good partnership. We couldn't do that we couldn't electrify the fleet until Vector and AT had that agreement in place. That was 2020, and working on there. So there's good happening, but it's how we can connect that all up. Right, Councillor Dalton, Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report and the presentation. I just wanted to talk about that regional stakeholder group that is currently being formed. So we know that we can't do this alone, and we know that we need to be the leaders in this for our city, and that requires political advocacy as well as management leadership as well. And I think we had part of that when we were developing the TERP, that we were checking in with some of those external companies. So we see the steel mill doing some good work out there in terms of reducing emissions. We see it with Countdown, lots of good stuff going on. So is that regional stakeholder group going to be how we show that leadership for the rest of the city, that we learn a best practice that was just spoken about, that we really drive that forward? And is that something that requires additional funding to be able to happen? And what is the time frame so far?
Sorry, through the chair. Thank you for the question. I'll start with the timeline. So the intention is to have the regional leadership set up in the next year. In terms of additional funding, I'm not sure yet. It's possible we may need more for its ongoing operation. So at the moment, the funding is for its initial setup, I think, and it will depend on its, I guess, eventual structure. And yes, the intention is for us to show leadership, but also for us to be able to partner with other organisations that have access, resource and knowledge to work together to nut out some of the really challenging areas that we've not been able to break through. And while we can't do this alone, a lot of the industry sectors can't do it alone either, and it does require that partnership, so that's where the real value is. But certainly we will be sharing the knowledge that we bring from our memberships through Climate Leaders Coalition, the C40 Cities membership as well, and sharing that with other stakeholders to help accelerate that action.
Thank you for that, and I reserve my right to speak too. Thank you.
Kia ora. Councillor Turner.
Thank you very much. I realise it's another monitoring report and my concerns are sort of the same as last time, but I'm looking here at the headline indicators, trying to work out how that information helps council construct decision making which affects what we're trying to get on the ground. So for instance, a 4% decrease or worse figures for emissions from stationary fuel consumption. I presume behind each of these figures you have a bunch of data where you've built up there. What's causing that? What's causing the disappointing results? Obviously an increase. You know, it's got a decrease in emissions here, but it's on a negative figure. So I presume there's an increase in stationary fuel usage.
So that's a positive. The decrease of 4% is a positive. It's less fuel being used, and therefore it's a benefit to the
So how did? So last night I was in West Auckland at a meeting with people and Vector, and they asked the room how many people have a stationary generator, and almost everybody put their hands up. My immediate family has 3 now where we never had one. I have a 6 kVA, one of my sons has a 6 kVA, and the other son has a 12 kVA. And if you try to buy a generator in Auckland at the moment, you've got to put yourself in an order because there's so much demand. We've got the Black Generator Company out in the concourse, huge company now, they're generators all over town. Vector tells us they have a stationary generator that now is going to be a permanent fixture at Piha. And that's in part, and I have the graph here they gave us, that's because their power outages are almost 60% vegetation and power line problems. I understand the role that vegetation and our forests have as sequential, but it gets really complicated how we make sure our overarching policies actually deliver good results on the ground. So how do we, where in here, where would you write the policy or tell us to do the things needed to achieve those more micro adjustments?
Through the chair, I think that would be an action for Vector. You're talking about.
Well,
meeting-
Victor told us last night that it's because they're not allowed to trim under the trees properly.
Oh,
And we've got tree rules which are good in one place, although they're not being followed on the mongers, but then under the power lines, everyone's scared to cut anything. So how do we, and that is having an absolute tangible result to how much diesel people use. People see that out there in the community. There was comments made about it last night. So I go on to the next thing.
Maybe I could, just on, Lauren, maybe I could help on that one, Councillor Turner, and maybe we set up a meeting, because what I have, 2 years ago we did a deal with Vector, so now it's community facilities because of this issue, and they have been, I think, more responsive at what I've heard on these issues and cutting right back to ensure the protection of the infrastructure. So I'm keen to check on that and see some instances. If someone in Vector is saying that they don't have, because the issue was Vector was doing it before and they've asked us to come in and do this work. So I will, we need to sit down and work that out if there's some confusion there or some issues. It's probably more a difficult one for Lauren to answer, but
Okay.
yeah, but that's been in place 2 years, so it should be working better than what that sounds like.
So the next question, food scraps, 41% of that is now going into landfill. What's the advantage in that? Is it an emission advantage or?
through the chair, sorry. It's an emissions reduction from landfills. So when organic matter breaks down in the landfill, it produces methane. So if we can reduce or remove all of the organic matter going to landfill, we can reduce our landfill emissions.
So Redvale landfill, which isn't finished yet, is powering 18,000 homes up there on gas-generated electricity, which they can't do if they don't have food scraps in it, because its production, the landfill's production of methane is much, much lower. As a result, we're collecting it in plastic bins which are made in Australia without using any recycled New Zealand plastic, and liners which are made in China, and we're trucking it to Reparoa to put into a digester. And then we're trucking back the leachate that comes out the bottom to sell here in Auckland. So I want to see the figures so that because I've seen some figures. All I'm saying is that the public on the ground, what they see is totally out of step with this really high stuff I'm discussing with you here today, and I'm hoping that we can connect that better.
So,
Through the chair, there is a study which has been done by the waste minimization team to demonstrate that the food scrap collection was still beneficial in terms of greenhouse gas compared to sending that to landfill. So that cost-benefit assessment has been done in terms of greenhouse gas point of view. And the collection of waste is actually, I wouldn't say negligible, but small compared to the wider emission of the food scraps. I don't know if you've been to visit a landfill or if you've been over one. The way it's managed, it's not fully sealed, it's not fully capped. There are some leaks in terms of greenhouse gas, including methane, before the methane is trapped and burned and generated transformed into electricity. So in terms of energy generation, a landfill is not the optimum way of capturing, collecting, and transforming that into electricity. A biodigester is definitely more confined and controlled in terms of the energy you produce from the same amount of waste. So yeah, that has been done. It's definitely good practice from across the world to divert as much waste from landfill as much as you can, organic waste, but others as well. So we understand the need and the benefits that can have the electricity generation out of a landfill, but that's really the end product of what should have been avoided in the first place. So the same, if we can avoid food scrap at the first stage, we won't end up with a waste minimization or waste generation or waste collection in the end. So yeah, hope that answered your question. Yeah, happy to discuss.
Cool, thanks, Councillor Turner. And the waste team, Parole can provide all the data, because there was a lot of questions about that at the beginning. And it is, once again, how do we get that 100,000 tonnes a year out of, which are currently going to landfill? This, there isn't a very easy, this was kind of the main approach. I had a lot of doubts and questions too, but that it's 100,000 tonnes of food waste a year that we need to have removed from the landfill. This will only cover about a month of that, won't it? And the full rollout hasn't been complete, so that's, we're not, it's good to have it there, but I think it would only be showing a very tiny part of what's going on. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick ones that follow from the slides that were up. At one point there, you referred to 63% of Aucklanders being engaged in living a lower carbon lifestyle, and a similarly high percentage for engaging with schools to do with sustainability. One of the key challenges, of course, is getting Aucklanders to follow and getting them to active and getting them to respond. So I'm very interested to know what the nature of that engagement was. What does that engagement with those Aucklanders amount to in terms of actions?
Through the chair, thank you for the question, Councillor Watson. So, are you asking the question around what types of engagement they've done? So, they've got a few different methods. Sorry. So they have a Live Lightly program, which is an engagement program. It's a combination of online engagement as well as hosting events in the community. They have a Future Fit program, which is designed for businesses to take on to engage their staff in more low carbon sustainable living. Those are the main areas. In terms of schools, there is the Enviro School program, where they are working with in numerous, quite large numbers of schools to encourage children and their families to live more sustainably.
Okay, thank you. And I guess part of the reason I bring that up, Mr. Chair, is often to signal that if we are to reach or progress in any way to some of these goals, the nature and level of engagement with the people of Auckland has to undergo a transformational change. My other question just goes to the section on, I think it was one of your last comments here, to do with the transport goals and the actions that are cost effective, and I think, excuse me, following on from yesterday, that are also quickly implementable, like quick wins if we go. Could you just give us a quick example of the kind of suite of things you're anticipating there that are actions that can be done quickly and cost effectively across the region or in certain parts of the region?
Thank you for the question. Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks, Lauren. By the chair. Thank you, Councillor, for the question. I think our eminent focus at the moment is similar to the long-term plan outcomes, to take a look at the existing network that we have and see how we're getting maximum efficiency out of that network, and to take a look at the investment programs that we've already got in place and assess how we might get better outcomes out of the expenditure that we've already got going forward. So really, it's definitely looking at that renewals budget and how we can leverage that for betterment and improvements, but also checking and sense checking that our current investment programs align with the outcomes of Te Tarukia, Tawhiri and the TURP. So that includes a whole wide variety of things, but particularly when we're coming along and we're making changes to the streetscape or our transport system, just double checking that we are moving towards the outcomes that we know we need to get in terms of emissions reduction. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Tim. Just to make that a little bit more accessible to people that may be listening to that, what might that mean in a typical ward across Auckland? What works would you be doing? What projects? How quickly have they done? What sort of things? Seeing that's going to be our focus clearly, as you know, as indicated yesterday.
Thank you. Yes, by the chair. Without pre-concluding what we need to do in any specific location, because it definitely needs to be tailor-made to each community's needs, and we need to consult with the community on that and involve them. But in particular, we'd be looking for opportunities where maybe we're not making the best use of existing street space. We might be able to get better efficiency in terms of bus lanes in particular, whether they're temporal, like time allocated bus lanes and an extension of the bus lane network. Cheaper and faster delivery of cycleways by either leveraging shared use pathways or pop-up cycleways. Better use of resources in terms of how we allocate and manage on-street parking and these sorts of things are a kind of direction that we can move in. I think there's possibly a step that comes before that, which is internal work that we can do with our organizations in terms of upskilling the knowledge base and our ability to engage with our communities to build support for these types of interventions. These are early actions that we can take to develop our own skill sets and our own organizational culture towards achieving these outcomes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Ferry.
Thank you. I had a question around trees as well, which is just going back to the urban ngāhere work, and apologies, this may not sit with your team, but I'm taking the opportunity to ask now. The council reached a settlement with the Tree Council, who've been doing a lot of important work in this space, around protection. We talk a lot about the planting aspects, and I think that's good and we need to do that. But in the protection space, there was a settlement reached in court between out of court, between the Tree Council and Auckland Council. I've been trying to get a bit of an update on that, and I'm going to raise it now to be cheeky and ask how it fits in with the climate plan work. And I reserve my right to speak when we get to comment. Thank you.
Through the chair. Sorry, Megan, do you have a response to that?
I'm just checking, was that one around some work to more fully do some work on the tree rules and the scheduling and things? Yeah, okay.
And sorry, I just remembered something else about it. So obviously we have Plan Change 83, but this should be in addition to that.
I don't think the team or I have an update for you now, but I'm very happy to get you one. Are you okay if I can come back to you,
that'd
please?
Be great. Thank you.
And we might be able to wrap it into the urban ngāhere plan we hope to bring to the next committee. Yeah, I mean, we can get you information before that, but for the public. Cool. Councillor Williamson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Can I ask if we could slide back to number 8, the graph, the exponentially decaying graph?
Figure 6. Is
it figure 6? Okay, that's it, yeah. The first question I want to ask before I get to some of this is, in paragraph 22 of the document, you finish off with saying, nevertheless, more funding will be required if significant progress toward TERP objectives is to be achieved. That begs a number of questions, and the first one is, how much funding is there already towards TERP if we're going to have more? So I'll ask that as my first question.
I'm wondering if I can pass that to Nick.
Through the chair, I don't actually have an update, but Tim may be better to answer the question around funding allocated for TERP.
It's Robert Simpson here, perhaps I can have a first stab at that. So there's we haven't made that calculation, what's been allocated to TERP specifically. We do know that in excess of $30 billion is earmarked to be spent on, invested in transport over 10 years, some of which will take us in the right direction in terms of TERP objectives, and some of it maybe less so.
Okay. If you say that you don't have a specific number, that then again begs the question further when it says, nevertheless, more funding will be required. And I guess my question is, how much more than the current amount for which we don't know?
Through the chair, Robert, I'll take this one. Councillor Williamson, I understand your questions. Overall, maybe I could say, and just following on from Robert's response, yes, there may well be some additional spend required for TERP, but TERP is also about doing things differently and or stopping things. So it's very hard to cost exactly what that pathway would cost over, say, a 20 or 30-year period. We know we have money right now. We know that that money, a lot of it will continue to be spent on, stuff that it's earmarked for. There are opportunities, though, to use that money differently, to either not do that work or to do that work in a different way. So with all of this, and this is the complexity, I think, of climate generally in what you're hearing from the team, but particularly in terms of transport emissions, there is a lot about what we can do differently that may not need any more money. It's just money that's put in different ways. But there will be some things, like, for example, I guess, whether it's electric buses or some kit like that, which probably is more money. There's a lot of money, though, that will need to be repurposed if this council and Auckland want it to be so.
Right. The reason I ask this is I'm really concerned about the number of times something is put into a document and then at a meeting 2 months later they said, oh, well, that was already done 2 months ago in July. We said there'd be more money needed. I don't think a sentence like, nevertheless, more funding will be required if significant progress towards TERP objectives is to be achieved, should be in a document like this unless it says how much more and on what and where is that based on what we're currently spending. Because otherwise it's all things to all people.
Look, sorry, through the chair, probably not that you care. Look, I would agree with your point. I mean, I'm not saying that you don't care what my point is.
Okay.
But no, I totally agree with your point. The difficulty we have with this, as I've said, is that it's such a mixture of doing things differently. Yes, there may be some new fun, but don't ever hear us say that the way to achieve TERP or our emission pathway reduction in transport is all about new money.
No.
You will never hear us say that, but there may well be some new investment that does need to come at certain points.
Okay, if I can come back to that graph, there are 11 data points on the graph. And I studied a very obscure form of mathematics called catastrophe theory. Yeah. And if you want to look it up, you can see that catastrophe theory will tell you how much of a change do you need to make in order to meet your target. And I had a look at that last night and ran it through some algorithms that I've got. It basically said the chances of hitting your 50% by 2030 based on that line is less than 0.01 of 1%, even with a catastrophic change to your circumstances. And it's a little bit like with 3 overs left of a cricket match and you're 109 runs behind, you can't win, because even with 3 overs and 6s on for every ball, you'll only get 108 runs. When will we make a decision that we cannot make that target and a new one be set? Because quite frankly, your chances of hitting that now, even with quite catastrophic changes, are still very, very low.
Through the chair, yes, you're right, and it gets harder and harder every year. Through Te Tarakia Tawhiri and the emission pathway is to say, in order to achieve that 2050 goal, this is the kind of pathway that's needed. Every year, and possibly every month to catastrophize it, but certainly every year that we don't make some big changes as a region, it will get harder and harder. If this committee wants to reconsider this, of course, this target reflects both a national target in terms of gross greenhouse gas emissions and, of course, international targets. We know that for Auckland, the transport emission is the biggest part of our response to that, as opposed to other parts of the country might have some different parameters. So if this council wants to change or rethink this target, then it is entirely up to to them to do it. We'll just need to hear that from you. But at the moment, this is the target. We are trying to describe how difficult, yes, this will be. We haven't given up hope yet. We do think we can get a long way, but the longer it takes us, the steeper is, as you know, the ability for us to do that in the curve.
All right, I'll leave it at that. I just think that the required run rate gets to a point where you can't actually make the run rate.
Through the chair, I was just, cricket analogies are up my alley. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, like a sports game, the target's set during the match, and hopefully if you're a good team, you don't leave the field, which it sounds like some people want us to do. Councillor Bartley.
Oh, thank you, because I totally switched off when people started talking about cricket. I wanted to ask my question, in terms of climate action, right, we really do, it does need to be about what we do in the transport space. That's my understanding, and this is where my brain is at right now. But how do we do this? And I suppose the question is more for Megan, like how can we achieve what we have up there for transport emissions when a lot of the responses seem to be coming back that we don't have the capacity? And I look at the cycling team is reduced, the numbers of staff there to be able to work on our, cycling program. Our transport advisors are so low in the council hierarchy, like we're not really giving transport much oomph ourselves within the organisation. And then on top of that, we really do need our communities on board with the big picture. And when I raised it yesterday in the workshop, the responses were that we don't have the capacity to do community engagement around climate and around our transport projects, and we lose people. And that's the only way we're going to achieve these transport targets, is if we have our communities understanding why we're putting that bus lane there, why we're putting that cycle lane there, why we're trying to remove parking in some places, and we just lose them because all people see is their disruption to their daily life. They don't see the big picture. So I do think community engagement is vital. When I was told we don't have the capacity, what about our, I'm kind of almost being the mayor and being practical with my response, but what about using our community brokers and strategic brokers and our community development team who are already out there in the communities? Like, is there a way to solve this so we can achieve our next steps that was in the slide up there?
Kia ora, through the chair. Thanks for the question. Of course, this is not about council having to do everything, and we must work with the community. And of course, the community does things better and differently than we can ever do as well. So, Tim, I might throw to you though. I know that you've working with Auckland Transport. You've probably got some ideas. Thanks.
Well done by the chair. Thank you for the question, councillor, and I think really well articulates the scale of the challenge in the transport space. So obviously there's no quick answer to this, but I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. And I think it's helpful to start by looking at how we've got to where we are and what we have. And what we have is that we've spent a very long time investing in a whole network of transport assets that make it relatively easy to get around in a way that is dependent on fossil fuels. For most people, they have a private motor vehicle. So in terms of the technical answer to the challenge, it's about taking the assets that we've already generated and that we already have and repurposing them as best we can into a low carbon way, whether that's through electrifying those existing vehicles or using the existing assets in a different way. So that's a little bit of the technical answer. But I think the interesting part of the question is really what's our cultural capacity and how can we build our cultural capacity to tackle the scale of change required in the transport space. And the important lesson from this is that we do have tools available. There is some really good research out there in terms of what we need to do in order to bring communities along on this journey. We know that leadership is very, very important and that, basically platforming and empowering that leadership, whether it comes from our communities, whether it comes from within our organizations, whether it comes from our elected representatives, is one of the best things that we can do. And that clearly communicating a vision and coming up with a strategy to help build support for that vision is a really effective way to help engage our communities and bring them along on the journey that we need. So I do see the decarbonisation of our transport sector as a really fantastic opportunity. There is a lot to do, but if we can communicate the vision with our communities that we're not just reducing the carbon emissions from our transport system, but we're simultaneously addressing those road crash trauma injuries, and that we're simultaneously creating an environment where more people can move around more easily, that this addresses equity issues, that this addresses accessibility and traffic congestion issues, we do find that we get community support. So we've got a number of programs running in that, and I won't elaborate too much for you right now, but one of the interesting things we had last Saturday was a deliberative forum where we brought together a wide variety of Aucklanders to discuss the problems that we have in the transport space and gather insights from a greater dispersion of Aucklanders. And it's one example of the kind of things that we're advancing in the transport space alongside the VKT reduction program to build that cultural capacity and really tackle it. So the important thing is we do know that there are tools there, and we're working on developing a strategy that uses those tools to try and build community support. Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, but it doesn't really answer my question. That's more about, like what you're going to be talking about to communities, but it's not about community engagement. So, like I still, we lose people when we're pretty much setting ourselves up to fail because we haven't gone out and engaged with them properly. And that what Tim's talking about is what we can talk to them about, but it's not about community engagement. And then my other question was more around internally, how are we taking it seriously? And I don't think Tim can answer that question about how do we elevate transport within the organisation? How do we bring in other parts of the council whānau to help with this kind of kaupapa, this work, like the community services team who are already out in our communities? Like as Chief of Strategy, like I was hoping for an answer from you.
Kia ora, through the chair. Look, the factors, there have been a number of factors we've been talking about today that have happened over the last few years, and really what we're seeing is a societal change now starting across the world and certainly into Auckland as well, probably over the next couple of decades. Council, in my view, should be a leader of this and empower others, a little bit like Tim was saying and others have said, to work through this change, which is coming, and particularly to make it an equitable change, if at all possible. And so there are things that Council does really well in that area. So part of that is also working with communities, both our own staff and our expertise, but also enabling communities to do what they do best for themselves and with each other. So I guess my answer is, yes, I'm sure we can do better as we're starting this journey. I'd like to, take your points. I'd also be great to talk with you, more about this. But I do know that both Auckland Transport and Auckland Council work well and work across our communities and across our different departments that work in our communities to try and, say two birds with one stone. But if we're going out to consult on something, we can also bring in other parts of the organisation or transport at the same time to talk to communities about 2 or 3 different things at the same time. So we need to get better at that, but that is something that we do and we try and do as much as we can.
Okay, yep. Oh, I'm happy to leave it there, but we have the expertise in council. I've seen them in our communities, and we just need to pair it all up. So the information, the intel, the expertise that Tim brings, but then also what our community development team are doing with our churches and our diverse communities, it needs to come into play. So thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Councillor. Member Ashby.
Thank you. Just a quick one, just trying to help in the tree space out in Waitakere, been involved with trying to develop some machine learning for tree census, and that doesn't necessarily rely on that LiDAR data set. So happy to have a conversation with your teams about that, just offline. Thanks.
Thanks, Member Ashby. Councillor Walker.
That graph up there, I would suggest that it is highly likely that the 11 data points that Councillor Williamson has referred to, if you add approximately another 5 data points, which brings us to now, produce a graph that is somewhat like a cliff. We all know that cliffs are highly risky. The probability is great, and in this instance, the magnitude is significant. So I would suggest that that's actually where we're at. We need to know that as quickly as possible. I think it's a no-brainer that those data points track up, they may be even worse, in which case we have a cliff.
What is the question, Councillor?
No, this is a statement now. I'm assuming I'm allowed to speak.
No, we're still on questions.
Would you like me to speak or not? I can do it now, I can do it later.
Until we've got one more question from Councillor Newman and then we can go into the debate.
Okay, I'll pick up then.
Councillor Newman, thank you.
Yeah, I'll join the comments at the end of it, but I did have a question with respect to storm recovery. So, just looking at that graph there, the BAU, can I ask, have you got any sort of data to capture what is the likely impact of emissions that will be triggered from storm recovery? I assume that cost of demolition, cost to rebuild will be very, very carbon intensive. I don't think anybody's anticipating that people are going to go and live in communal tents here, but there is going to be a significant impact, even if you build the most 6-star, Green Star, environmentally friendly houses, and you've got all new networks and what have you, it's still going to be extremely carbon intensive. You will not be able to avoid that. You can't sequester carbon for this purpose. But have you got any of that data? Because I feel like that the broken yellow line that's tracking up is actually much higher than that, because just for the storm recovery alone. So what do you know about that?
We are setting up some tools and calculation to make sure that we anticipate those upcoming costs or expenses or decision in terms of what are the likely carbon impact on those. So we are trying to move away from that backward-looking curve to something a bit more forward-looking, and to try to anticipate those greenhouse gas impact of the decision making. So that's definitely something around the long-term plan that is integrated into the long-term plan now. In terms of storm recovery for that, yes, it's going to have some impact on that. We are still at the early learning planning stage, so we have the opportunity to do it differently and to have some resilient measures, or to build differently and to build back better in a way that it's climate resilient but also low carbon. So we are at that point where we need to rebuild some stuff, and we have the ability to take that decision about do we build the same way we used to build before, and then we track against that BAU curve, or we do things a bit differently and have a different approach, integrate a bit more nature-based solution, integrate a bit more carbon sequestration in the mix, and use different materials that can be reused, that can be repurposed, that can be sequestrating carbon as well. So we are at that pathway, I guess, for the storm recovery, where we could have a strong opportunity to integrate climate mitigation and climate resilience in the decision making. I don't know if you want to add anything, Petra?
That's not on the curve yet, is it? You haven't got that in there? Is that a yes or a no?
I will have it in 2 months' time to present for the LTP.
Okay, no today, yes, in a couple of months, that's fine. Do you think that your aspiration for, you know, complete re-look at this and do the whole thing differently, that's lovely, but do you think that the affected communities might think that that's just not going to work for them? They want a recovery so they can get on with their lives here, and they're going to want to get back, they're going to see some betterment, some renewal, which might end up looking a bit of business as usual in terms of what we had before, and we will have some change, but you're going to have to do something that's going to generate a lot of carbon. And so do you have any sort of back of napkin numbers at the moment, or are you just basically needing the additional 2 months to come up with some numbers and some science to back that up?
I will need to have some more data to back that up once the storm recovery program is a bit more formalized, but once we've got some direction in terms of the program, we can definitely estimate the...
If I can make a comment later, Chair, thanks.
Yeah, you're already on the list for that, Councillor, thank you. I'll just get the staff to move back. Thank you very much for that. We'll move into debate. I'll just move the recommendations Councillor Dalton would like to second. And we'll go straight to Councillor Walker.
So I'll just pick up. So if we extrapolate the data, essentially we have a graph that looks like a cliff. You pretty much take yourself out close to 2025. It's a sharp line. There are a number of things that we can do. If we accept that the conversion of stationary energy and transport requires the electrification of everything, we have to deploy a phenomenal amount of electricity. Where's it going to come from? Where's the buffering capacity in terms of batteries to cope with the peak loads that we experience across cars, buses, trains, planes, ferries, households, everything? We need an energy strategy for Auckland. I've been approaching people like Simon Bridges, and I spoke to Vector, was it late last year or earlier, Auckland Airport Ports. Everybody's up for it. They're looking for some leadership from the council. It's not there. We need to provide that leadership. Fundamentally, the deployment of those things takes time. So, picking up on Councillor Williamson's comment, we already know that there's a physical impossibility of achieving that target now unless we start preparing for it. And if you talk with energy experts and so on, as I do, they will tell you that. So please, can we move to have an energy strategy for Auckland? We don't even need to resource it significantly, we just need to facilitate it. It is urgent, because otherwise we can't deliver on rail, because the CRL requires more peak capacity. We certainly can't deliver on buses or ferries or anything for that matter. So we need that. The other thing that we should be doing is doing what other cities do, collaborate and actively talk with other parties, like Tesla, for example, who put in batteries in South Australia and solve their problem. Those sorts of companies can deploy fast and immediate. The solutions are actually there. What are we doing about it? Yesterday, I asked Auckland Transport who's working on electrification. There was one person, together with other things. They were in the room. So that gives you some idea of just where we're at in terms of arriving at these targets. We need to collaborate with other cities, and we've dropped off the map there. We used to be a member of ICLEI, smaller cities, cities involved with political leadership, so we could pick up off that. Political leadership in this space, frankly, is not sufficient. Certainly in the 10 years or more since I led out the first climate strategy, we're in implementation phase, but we don't have implementation targets. Councillor Watson asked some questions. What are the short-term fixes? The answer was basically no. There wasn't anything anybody could come up with. So there's some urgency here, picking up on Councillor Williamson's comments. We need to know what the return on investment is, because we have to interest other parties in this. They need to invest capital. This is all about the deployment of a significant amount of capital in technology. That is the only way that we can solve these problems. So I'm making a plea to my fellow councillors to actually put some recommendations so that we show some leadership and start driving things. Go back to the graph. We're on the edge of a cliff. Are you up for it? I think Auckland's up for it, but are we? Is Auckland Transport? I'll leave you to answer those questions. So I am uncomfortable to just keep putting things off to other meetings, other strategies, almost all of which are disjointed. There's clear leadership required. There's clear collaboration on the part of the business sector and others out there. And there's actually money to be made out of this if you can actually do it the right way. So I am at a point where I personally am very disturbed at what I see. I continue to raise these issues and make suggestions on an ongoing basis. Is anybody going to pick up on it? Where is the leadership? Thank you.
Councillor Ferry.
Sorry, I thought I was going to have to wave my hand again, so I wasn't quite prepared there. No, that's fine. So one of the things that's quite stark to me in these conversations, it's something I noticed in local board land as well, is sometimes we say you a lot in these conversations, and actually we should be saying we. And I guess I would just point some of my colleagues to the fact that we actually hold the leadership here. We have the ability to direct resources towards these things. We have the chance to make change. And that we encompasses those of us at the table, it encompasses the broader organisation and our communities as well. So I guess I just challenge a few people to start thinking about shifting from you to we, because that's how we're going to get there. I did just want to say a few things about trees, and I'm really interested in your point, Ed, about how we can do some of that mapping better and so on. So we do now have, through the Natural and Built Environment Act, which was just passed through the third reading recently, the opportunity for a national planning framework around urban trees. We have the opportunity coming up for us as a council to look at reinstating general tree protection, which was removed some years ago. And so that will hopefully help in the protection space. But I do just want to put a shout out there for the work that the Tupuna Maunga Authority has been doing. I get really concerned when I hear people talking about them cutting down a lot of trees, that they're not following the rules. They actually, on Oairaka, Mount Albert alone, have a plan to put in 13,000 natives. And we've been talking about the removal of under 400 trees in that context. So, you know, people do need to look at the whole picture. They need to look at the aspiration Tupuna Maunga Authority have, which they constantly reiterate and are keeping to, of cloaking our maunga in native flora and fauna, acknowledging that sometimes that requires building an understory before you can plant the bigger, more mature trees, and that will take time. But recently, we had posted in a Facebook group in Mount Albert some pictures of the tree growth from a planting that I actually took part in, I think it was 5 years ago, and already showing the significant growth. And we all will have areas that we're aware of, whether they're maunga or in local parks, where we've seen great growth from the plantings we're doing. So while we do need to do protection and we do need to do growth, I guess I would just point to the fact that a lot of this work is amazing and is happening, and it'd be great if we could tell more of those positive stories. Instead of focusing on a very small number of trees that are going as part of a comprehensive plan to massively increase the number of trees on those sites. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, look, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll leave the Tupuna Maunga Authority debate to people to my right, but with respect to, yeah, we do things. We pass a budget and we pass statements of intent to make this happen. That's what we do, or we should do. And I think that's a very important point because the decisions that we took in relation to this year's budget were very hard. But there were things that were decided at that time in May when we had those debates that were designed to try and enable some of the stuff that we're talking about here. So that's why I voted for the budget, one of the reasons. But I did want to just pick up one point, and I'm a little sensitive to this, that with respect to the waste to energy eco-gas work in relation to anaerobic digestion of food waste, I accept the anxiety of some people here that not sure that it's a value for money. I think that the sorting site in Hunua Road, and I think that the site at Reparoa, it is quite good. I think that there is certainly a benefit to division of waste from landfill, turning it into energy biogas. But I take the challenge. I mean, the reason I love sitting next to Councillor Turner is he takes a debate from the esoteric, which it so often is around here, back to the hard implementation conversation, which it should be. And I do admire you, Ken. I think that it would be really good to spend some time out at that Hunua Road site. The trucks, I think, that go down to Reparoa, I think they're hydrogen, I'm not sure. Well, they will be in the future, I'm sure, but
They run on food scraps.
but there is an issue insofar as the recovery is going to be carbon intensive. These roads that are taking these electric vehicles and electric buses in the future are going to be very expensive, and that will trigger more requirement for funding for renewals of the existing road network, which will be expensive and it will be carbon intensive, because that is the price for what will be the key method for moving people and freight, which will continue to be via vehicles, whether it be buses or privately owned. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor, thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I wasn't planning on speaking up, but we're talking about cricket analogies, so I thought I had to jump in. Look, I've played cricket since I was 6 years old. I know very well about run chases, and I just wanted to address the point earlier made that, you know, if the run rate's going up and you're chasing, you can't cut the target. You know, you have to just swing for the fences and you have to fight even harder than you were before. And so this is the situation that we're in. I don't for a moment believe that there is a safe assumption that we're continuing to go up since 2019. I think the data needs to come in before we can make an assumption like that, especially when you consider 2020 when half of us were working from home anyway. So we'll just see about that as a long tail on that sort of data. But I reiterate the point that I made the other day. You know, we've got to recommit to things like TERP, where we're putting more people into mass rapid transit, which has huge positive climate implications. Local boards are doing really wonderful work. Shout out to places like Puketapapa, a place like Henderson Massey, I'm sure there's others as well, that are doing climate action plans that are fantastic, that have no funding attached. We're talking about the LTP, and we're doing this right now. We need to be continually at the front of our mind, I think, considering climate change emissions, considering what expenditure we need to take on to actually cut those emissions and meet the targets that we promised Aucklanders. Thank you, Chair.
Kia ora, Councillor, thank you. Deputy Chair Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points I wanted to talk to. One of them is around that regional stakeholder group, and what I would like to request is that we sit down, you and I, perhaps with Megan, and just talk about what this looks like, because it does need political advocacy. We really need to, wrong terminology, but put a V8 engine in the in getting that up and going, because this is absolutely bigger than all of us, and we need to figure out how we're going to do that across Auckland. So it's a conversation we need to progress ahead of the LTP. We talked about, well, Councillor Bartley talked about communication with communities, and as what we have done, what we all did, was cut the budget, and what a significant impact that had. So when the majority of this council voted for a freeze, this is what happened. spending was cut to community engagement. So spending on professional services and constraints and moving forward with the specialist work was cut in 23. On top of that pause, there had to be savings found within the financial year 24 budget, and that just exacerbated things. So that was around behaviour change, which is connecting with community. So specifically around that, there was $1 million reduction from the LTP Climate Action Programme as part of the financial year 24 budget. That was a specific focus on behaviour change climate initiatives. Work to support Māori-led climate action as part of the Kia ora te Tātai programme was paused, so we were unable to move to progress marae funding agreements with iwi mana whenua and delivery of the rangatahi climate projects. The Enabling Auckland's programme was delayed by the pause on spending. So, you know, as political leaders, we need to understand what we're doing when we say we're going to have a freeze or we're going to cut money out of the next year's budget when it comes to our responsibilities that we spoke about yesterday around climate action. We're hanging on the edge of a cliff in terms of that graph because we haven't made the right decisions. This is us. We did this, even those of us that weren't sitting around the table at that time. That graph is going down because the investment hasn't been made. And so if we talk about TERP, and Megan summed it up really well, this is about repurposing the budget. It always was. It was always about repurposing existing budgets. But until people can make that shift in their minds or in their politics, that graph, we're going to continue hanging off the edge of it. And yes, there will be more money required as we have to invest in the infrastructure, whether it's budgets or not. But you're right.
Is there something wrong, Councillor Lee?
Just an aside, sorry, to my colleague.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor Dodd.
Some local boards are doing really well and some not so well. So we do have some local boards out there that are not supportive of repurposing roads. They're not supportive of protected cycleways. They're not supportive of housing near public transport. They're stopping all of those things. They're saying no all the time. All the time they're saying no. I feel for those communities that don't have the political leadership to be able to take them into the future. They're stuck. They're absolutely handbraked. And even opposing the climate action targeted rate. What sort of leadership is that? Where clearly we can see we have a dilemma and we need to resolve it. And we need to take the whole city with us. But it's very difficult when there isn't a political will to be able to show that leadership. So I thank the officers again for the report, for all the work that's been done. The achievements that haven't been made is because they're not funded, because we're not funding it, we're cutting the funding, and we aren't all agreeing. And that's been said many times before. This is an ideology, this isn't going to work, we're not going to, my people don't want that, so we're not going to do it. We have a responsibility to the whole city. And the majority of the city voted for the Climate Action Plan, and they want us to move them forward. And that's our responsibility to do that. Thank you, Chair.
Kia ora, Deputy Chair, thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I'm happy to support this. I want to thank the staff for their work that they've done. A lot of what I was going to say probably has been said, and a lot of it is based around money, but baby steps are better than no steps at all, you know. And I think, you know, I've spoken to you, as you know, about the comms around this, and respectfully to any media in the room, I just think collectively we need to do some communication out, because if the Deputy Chair of this committee wants to deliver on what she says, we actually have to use all 170 plus of us to make the change that we need. Look, in the interest of being positive, I was just going to highlight how the good folk of the Ōrākei ward have made some positive contributions, i.e. the shared path, GI to Tamaki Drive, with my colleague, Councillor Bartley, the Tamaki Drive improvements, so they're walking there. The winter gardens, a little thing, but the boiler change there saves over 100 tonnes of carbon dioxide because we've changed the way we do that. We've got more buses. We're lucky to be an area that have, had more frequency around the buses. So, look, they are baby steps, but they're things that are happening. And I think we need to talk about those positive steps and put it from a comms perspective in the interests of what we're trying to achieve and why. And then, hopefully, as the Deputy Chair says, we will take Auckland with us. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Watson, last speaker, unless anyone else wants to speak.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't be very long, and I agree with those positive comments from Councillor Simpson there. Just to take the cricket analogy just one little step forward. I hope it's not one of those games where the team's chasing a big score, 400, and they're 8 or 9 wickets down, and there's still 10 or 15 overs to go, and they're just batting out for survival. So I hope we're not like that. I hope we do have a Lance Kearns or a Finn Allen coming in at number 8 or 9 to activate the run chase, because that's definitely what's needed here. And in my questions, although there was a degree of jest earlier on, we have to start with the so-called small actions and then speak to our wider Auckland community as a whole. I don't see a lot of evidence of that small actions around to get people going. When proposals are put up like, utilising the existing pavement network, particularly out in the outer suburbs, perhaps not, not around the central city or the inner suburbs, there's almost, a categoric dismissal. Yet for me, there's infrastructure there. It's not getting used in a lot of places. It happens overseas in places like Tokyo. Why aren't we pushing for that? It is an accessible street, so Waka Kotahi put that up as a solution, a very detailed solution that could be implemented in a safe way. That's gone nowhere. But I don't want to, repeat the cannot do. We've got to get to the can do. We've got to provide some leadership, like Councillor Walker was saying, to bring the willing and able along initially, and then progressive numbers of people thereafter. But we have to get, it's no just point us talking about it within the confines of this room. We have to get out to all those people out in the community, a number of whom are too busy concentrating on trying to survive at the moment, but amongst them there are significant numbers. So, I look forward to Finn or Lance when they stride to the crease, and when they stride to the crease, they'll just have a bat. They can't bring in another element, it's got to be a cricket bat. We've already got that bat here in terms of our public transport system, our CRL coming online, our Northern Busway, our ferry services in most places. Most people have got reasonable mobility. They could be walking now, they could be cycling if indeed that's the future. Yeah. So that bat's already there. It needs to be persuaded for the relative players to pick it up and start using it. Therein ends the cricket analogy.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, Westies just asked, what's the Duckworth-Lewis method? Is that a way we could get round this?
I think that's far too complex for this committee. Before I close up, I'm just checking, is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Right. Thank you. Thanks again to the staff. Thanks for the spirited debate around the table, but it is all of the things everyone is saying. I will thank Councillor Williamson again for being the only member around the table that actually signed the Paris Agreement as part of the government he was part of, which was acknowledged by Minister Paula Bennett at the time as a heroic document, an unfunded mandate, as she pointed out, but it was a target. It was a target that 160 countries, and the government at that time, thank you, Morris, again, were one of the first 55 countries to sign up to that. So I really appreciate your leadership there, Councillor Williamson, for climate change. But I guess that is what we're here as well. The issue is that we are on a pathway. We have had a lot of difficult situations hit us as a country and as a city in the last 4 years that are putting pressure on dealing with this issue. But it's not going away. The targets we have in Te Tarakia Tawhiri, which we at that time unanimously approved, and no one is putting up a notice of motion to remove it yet, as far as I've seen, that they are science-based. They are science-based and they are based on the Paris Agreement. They are based on those targets, and we are trying to point out to Aucklanders and to ourselves what it takes to achieve that. When we talk about more funding for the TERP, that is around public transport, walking and cycling. So it's not, even before the TERP, we were always saying, I wish we had more funding for public transport, walking and cycling. That's always going to be the case. As we discussed at the workshop yesterday, there is other things that we can do to change behaviours or add budgets to renewal funding to ensure we're doing one dig once and not upsetting communities by digging streets up every couple of years to add things. But there are good things we have done. I mean, if we talk about leadership, number of us pushed for that $150 million extra in 2021, which rapidly started our decarbonisation of our public transport fleet. Then, at that time, I tried for the climate action targeted rate, but no one was that keen. But a year later, we passed with 80% or 70 or 80% support from the people who submitted, wanted $1 billion to go for climate action. Obviously, there are good co-benefits with that, around 78 new bus routes or improved bus routes with 10 frequent bus routes. We've seen those 2 that have started recently have 4,000 people a day taking them. That is a tangible, it's not huge, but it's a tangible change that we will see. I did, get a little annoyed with the comments around our cycling before because the figures are affected by COVID. Obviously, there were far fewer people coming into the centre, the city centre. But by investment in cycling, which once again, I have thanked Morris before for this. We did get more cycle budget from the last national government than we have from this current government, and that helped us increase our cycle counts from around 800,000 in 2014 to pre-COVID was 3.75 million, which is huge. And it doesn't measure the whole city, it's measuring specific routes based on the investment. People did not believe that people on the North Shore were going to take public transport. 2009, I think we were around 600,000 users a year on the Northern Busway. Before COVID, we were at 8.5 million trips a year. That is phenomenal, and it reduced the number of cars coming over the bridge every morning by a significant amount. So that's obviously saving us money, and we will need to do something there. There is a lot going on, 1.6 million trees planted this year. The focus in our regional parks will make a difference. We're about to embark on a Making Space for Water program, which, yes, will have great adaptation focus, but it will also provide a lot of carbon benefits for our city. Opening up those awa again, getting more greening of our city, having more access of walking and cycling around our communities. We saw during lockdowns that kids were out everywhere in my community walking and cycling around the streets because it was safe. So there is things we need to do to get people back enthused, to feel like confident, to do great things in our city, which also happen to reduce our emissions. But I'm not keen to change our targets because the targets are based on what the rest of the world is supposed to be aiming for. And if every one of us removed our action, then no one would be reducing our emissions. Yes, it does look like a cliff, but that's the reality. So we're not anywhere near where we're supposed to be, but there is a lot of good happening and we just need to ramp that up. I'm opening the Waido Community Recycling Centre on Saturday. We are halfway through our Community Recycling Centre rollout, which will be 23 by the end of the LTP. We're up to halfway through, which was hard to believe a few years ago. There is a lot going on, but we need to do this and we need to continue. Right, all those in favour?
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Thank you. I'll have that declared unanimously. Right, we're going to go for lunch for half an hour and be back at 2.